They had been taught to expect hatred. For months, the German prisoners whispered stories of British vengeance, of camps where men disappeared into mud and hunger, where defeat stripped a soldier of his name. As the trucks rattled north through the gray countryside, they sat in silence, clutching their coats tighter against the damp air, bracing for the punishment they believed awaited them. Every fence post seemed a warning, every gust of wind another reminder that they were now the enemy's burden. The world outside the canvas flaps smelled of rain and coal smoke. They passed villages still scarred by bombings, glassless windows staring back like hollow eyes. Somewhere in those ruins they imagined their captors' grief made flesh. Widows, orphans, smoldering anger. What mercy could survive such loss? Each man rehearsed the humiliation to come, the barked orders, the hunger rations, the hard ground that would become his bed. The mind finds safety in predictability, even in cruelty. And yet, beneath the hum of the engine, a quieter thought lingered. What if this was not revenge? None dared voice it. The thought itself felt treacherous, almost naive. Still, as the convoy slowed before a line of wooden gates, some instinct stirred, the faint hope that captivity might not mean degradation. In that fragile pause between fear and arrival, the war inside them began to shift, ever so slightly, toward the unimaginable possibility of kindness.
The convoy stopped with a sigh of brakes and the clatter of metal chains. Boots met the gravel, hesitant, deliberate, as the prisoners stepped down one by one. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and coal ash, that familiar scent of an island soaked in rain. Ahead, behind barbed wire that glistened like threads of glass, stood rows of huts. Yet something was off. From somewhere deep within the camp came the low hum of harmony, voices blending softly like a hymn carried by wind. It wasn't the bark of guards or the clank of rifles they expected. It was singing. They froze. A few turned instinctively, as if to confirm what they heard was real. The melody drifted across puddles, mingling with the rhythmic squeak of a gate opening. Inside, British soldiers moved without cruelty, measured, calm, almost courteous. One of them nodded toward a hut and gestured to follow. The Germans, still stiff with disbelief, walked past neat rows of flower beds. A stray cat curled near a stovepipe, and a small notice board pinned with announcements. This was not the cruelty they had rehearsed in fear. Somewhere, the choir swelled, notes rising through drizzle and iron fences alike. Kindness, they realized, had a sound, and it was nothing like war. In the days that followed, the prisoners began to notice the quiet order that governed everything. The guards were firm but never harsh. Commands were given with restraint, not anger. There were rules, certainly, curfews, inspections, work details, but each was delivered with an air of principle rather than punishment. The British seemed to believe that discipline was not the opposite of mercy, but its companion. In their steadiness, there was a strange dignity that made resentment difficult to sustain.
Meals arrived on time, modest but sufficient. Books appeared in the barracks, their spines worn from use. Evenings brought the murmur of conversation rather than the echo of threats. It was as if the camp itself had been designed to remind everyone, captors and captured alike, that humanity could survive the machinery of war. To the Germans, raised on rhetoric of domination, this restraint felt more unsettling than hostility. It carried a kind of moral authority, a quiet power that asked for no submission yet commanded respect. For the first time, some began to wonder whether true strength might look like this, the ability to control without cruelty, to win without hatred. The war, it seemed, could be fought on very different terms. It began with a single shelf, a wooden plank nailed between two posts in the corner of a drafty hut, lined with books that smelled of ink and dust. The Germans approached it cautiously at first, unsure if it was meant for them or merely decoration. But the British officer who oversaw the camp had smiled lightly and said, "They're for reading, not display." So the shelf grew. Week by week, it filled with novels, histories, poetry, dictionaries, donations from nearby towns, and even from families who'd lost sons to the very men now turning those pages.
The library became the quiet heart of the camp. Mornings of labor ended with afternoons of thought. Men who once memorized the clatter of rifles now memorized words. They debated Goethe and Shakespeare, argued over philosophy, wrote letters about redemption and memory. The act of reading, simple, private, sacred, made them feel human again. Each book was a small rebellion against the brutal simplicity of war. Even the guards began to notice the silence that reading brought, a different kind of order, earned, not enforced. Through those pages, the prisoners were no longer captives of ideology, but explorers of thought. The British had built something far stronger than walls, a sanctuary of minds. It started with a hum, barely audible, a thread of sound in the cold evening air. One man began, then another joined, and soon the barracks filled with low voices blending in hesitant harmony. No instruments, no conductor, just memory and breath. They sang softly at first, old folk songs from their childhoods, hymns remembered from church pews, melodies carried through mud and battlefields. The sound moved like smoke between bunks, curling around the dim glow of lanterns. It was not defiance, it was release.
When the British officers heard it, they did not silence the voices. Instead, they opened the hall and offered space for the choir to grow. There, under the watchful quiet of the guards, hundreds of men sang, not of victory or homeland, but of longing and mercy. The music rose above the wire fences, carried across the wet fields into the night. Some of the guards lingered outside, listening in stillness, unsure why their eyes burned. In song, the prisoners found a strange freedom. Their voices, stripped of rank and guilt, became instruments of forgiveness. Each note seemed to mend something unseen, as if harmony itself could undo the damage of hate. For a few moments each night, captivity dissolved into pure human sound.
When letters were finally permitted, the men wrote as though language itself might absolve them. The camp provided thin paper and dull pencils, and for hours the barracks fell into a tender silence, broken only by the scratch of lead. Some wrote to wives who no longer waited, some to mothers still lighting candles in ruined homes. Others confessed they did not know what to say at all. Words felt both too heavy and too fragile. The British guards collected the envelopes carefully, sometimes offering an extra sheet or translating a hesitant phrase. There was no mockery, no triumph, only the quiet understanding that grief belonged to everyone. When replies came weeks later, they were read in solitude. Faces turned away. Tears were not forbidden, and so they came easily, soft and unashamed. Those letters carried more than news. They carried the weight of rediscovered tenderness. Through ink and paper, men remembered what it meant to care, to hope, to be forgiven by someone far away. In the stillness that followed, the war seemed to loosen its grip on their hearts. The barbed wire remained, but inside, something fragile and human had begun to grow back.
Britain's decision to treat its captives with decency was not born from sentiment alone. It was strategy, shaped by moral vision. The nation, weary from years of blood and ruin, understood that cruelty would not rebuild what war had broken. Vengeance could satisfy for a moment, but it could not educate, heal, or prevent another generation of hatred. Behind every humane policy was a quiet calculation. To win the peace, one must first win the conscience.
Officials in London debated not how to punish, but how to reform. The camps became moral laboratories, designed to test whether men, even enemies, could be guided back towards civilization through fairness. To the British, maintaining dignity under duress was proof of strength, a kind of victory invisible on the battlefield. Every decent meal, every allowance for study or song became a statement to the world that Britain would not mirror the barbarism it fought to defeat. The idea was revolutionary. Treat the prisoner not as a symbol of guilt, but as a student of recovery. In doing so, Britain guarded its moral identity. The war might end in treaties and parades, but the peace that followed would be measured in how gently a nation handled its former enemies. Inside those fenced worlds, rehabilitation took quiet, deliberate form. Each camp became a small university of the fallen, where classes replaced commands, and chalk dust softened the echoes of war. Former professors taught literature beneath bare bulbs, carpenters showed others how to build furniture, and debate circles formed around questions that once divided nations. What is duty? What is truth? What is forgiveness? The air, once thick with suspicion, began to hum with the rhythm of thought. Art flourished too. Men carved figures from scrap wood, painted scenes of home from memory, and staged plays that wrestled with guilt and hope. Through these acts, they rediscovered fragments of identity long buried beneath obedience. Learning turned captivity into reflection, and reflection into quiet liberation.
The guards observed it all with a kind of astonished respect. Minds, it seemed, could not be imprisoned as easily as bodies. With every discussion and drawing, the men rebuilt themselves, not as soldiers of ideology, but as individuals capable of choice. In those fragile classrooms and makeshift studios, the human spirit practiced the art of becoming whole again. To the British, compassion was not naivete, it was foresight. Each act of kindness inside the camps served a purpose larger than mercy. It was an investment in the kind of Europe that might rise from the ruins. These men, once instruments of destruction, would one day return home to rebuild a nation. If they carried bitterness back with them, the next war would already have begun. But if they left with memory of decency, perhaps they would teach it forward. The policy of humane treatment was thus both moral and political, a way to reshape the defeated without humiliation. Empathy became a quiet weapon of reconstruction, softening hardened minds more effectively than punishment ever could. Britain sought not to erase the enemy, but to re-educate the man within him. When the prisoners eventually stepped beyond the gates, many would remember the books, the songs, the patient discipline, not the barbed wire. That memory was Britain's truest victory, proof that restraint could influence more deeply than revenge. In the long arithmetic of peace, compassion turned out to be the sharper strategy, and dignity the most enduring form of power.
The first emotion was disbelief. When the guards removed the cuffs and gestured toward neat lines of huts, the prisoners hesitated, as if expecting a trick. The ground was clean, the fences well kept, and there was no shouting,
No kicks or raised rifles. A pot of tea steamed near the gatehouse, the smell mingling with the chill of rain. To men who had marched through villages of ash, such order felt unreal, almost taunting. Their minds searched for cruelty hidden behind the politeness, for punishment delayed. None came. That night, under blankets that smelled faintly of soap instead of rot, many lay awake, unable to accept comfort. Silence itself felt suspicious. They watched the guards walk their rounds, calm, unhurried, exchanging quiet words that carried the rhythm of routine, not hatred. Some prisoners flinched at small kindnesses, the offer of bread, a clean shirt, as though generosity might wound more than a blow. In the morning, when they were assigned simple tasks, mending fences, sorting supplies, they waited for derision that never arrived. It dawned slowly, unsettlingly, that they were not despised. The shock was not in being imprisoned, but in being treated as men again. It was a new kind of captivity, one that freed the conscience before the body.
Letters and diaries from those camps would later echo with the same astonished refrain. They treat us like humans. One young lieutenant wrote home, unable to mask his confusion. I was certain they would hate us. Yet they greet us as if we are guests. Another described how a guard helped him mend a torn coat, not out of pity, but simple decency. For men raised to believe that mercy was weakness, this quiet civility felt disorienting, even humbling. In the evenings, they shared stories of moments that had softened them. A guard who lent his pipe, a British doctor who tended a fevered man as gently as his own brother. Each act stripped away the armor of ideology, revealing something raw and familiar underneath. Over time, resentment gave way to reflection. The prisoners began to see their captors not as moral adversaries, but as examples of the world they might one day hope to rejoin. What began as suspicion transformed into gratitude. Kindness had worked its quiet alchemy, turning shame into introspection. One German wrote in his journal, "They have conquered us twice, once by arms and once by character." And in that admission, dignity began its slow return. Winter brought a strange kind of intimacy. The British guards and the German prisoners, once divided by propaganda and blood, now shared the same cold, the same breath that turned to fog in the morning air. They repaired roofs together after storms, passed tools back and forth without words, and found laughter in small absurdities, a spilled bucket, a clumsy translation, a shared complaint about the food. The boundaries of uniform began to blur.
On Christmas Eve, one camp gathered in the dining hall. A prisoners' choir sang softly in German, while a British sergeant accompanied them on an old piano. For a moment, no one remembered which side they were on. The war outside those fences seemed distant, like a bad dream receding with dawn. Some men wept quietly, others simply closed their eyes and listened. In those fragile nights of shared music and labor, an unspoken brotherhood formed, one that neither victory nor defeat could erase. It wasn't forgiveness in the grand sense, but something gentler. Recognition. Two sides, stripped of flags and fear, saw themselves mirrored in one another's humanity. And for the first time, perhaps, both knew what peace might sound like. When the gates finally opened, the men walked out not as enemies released, but as students completing an invisible education.
Some carried books instead of souvenirs. A few pressed folded drawings or poems against their chests, proof of what they had regained. They left in silence, glancing back at the camps that had paradoxically taught them how to live again. For many, departure did not feel like escape, but like parting from a strange kind of home. Months later, letters began to arrive at British addresses. Former prisoners wrote to thank their captors, sending photographs of newborn children or small wooden carvings made in gratitude. Some invited their former guards to visit Germany to see the farms and towns they were rebuilding. "You showed us the better side of man," one letter read, "and we are trying to build a country that deserves it." These words, written by men once sworn to destroy Britain, carried more power than any treaty.
Reconciliation did not come through politics. It arrived quietly, in envelopes, in handshakes, in the steady rhythm of human decency remembered. The war had ended, but its echo, softened by compassion, lingered in friendships that defied history itself. The rehabilitation of prisoners became a mirror for the rehabilitation of Europe itself. The same ideals that guided the camps, education, dignity, restraint, would later guide reconstruction. Across the continent, nations exhausted by vengeance began to see that rebuilding required more than bricks. It demanded a moral architecture. The lessons learned behind wire and weathered wood seeped quietly into post-war policies, influencing schools, diplomacy, even the formation of a fragile peace. Many former prisoners became teachers, engineers, and writers who carried Britain's example home like an invisible inheritance. They spoke of fairness, of treating others as individuals rather than ideologies. In villages once gutted by hate, libraries reopened, choirs reformed, and the belief in dialogue returned. It was as though the very soul of Europe had decided to choose reflection over rage. In that sense, the camps became unexpected seeds of renewal. Out of defeat came understanding. Out of captivity, a philosophy of coexistence. Britain's restraint, measured not in pride but in purpose, had sown something durable. The continent began to realize that peace was not simply the absence of war, it was the presence of respect. Through compassion's quiet insistence, both men and nations began to remember who they were meant to be.
Memory became the gentlest weapon of all. Those who had lived through captivity carried their recollections like lanterns, small lights against the darkness of forgetting. They told their children not just of bombs and battles, but of the kindness that had confounded them, the shared bread, the books, the songs that had outlasted the war. In their stories, mercy became a kind of armor, proof that humanity could endure even when nations lost their way. Years later, when tempers flared and old wounds reopened, these memories served as quiet reminders that compassion had once triumphed where violence had failed. To remember goodness was to defend it. Each recollection was a vow, never to let cruelty feel inevitable again. And in that gentle act of remembering, the world found its most enduring peace. A peace built not on power, but on the memory of decency. They say wars are remembered through victories and losses, but sometimes the truest victories are so quiet they almost go unheard. In countless British camps scattered across the countryside, small moments began to stitch a deeper kind of healing. A guard who slipped an extra slice of bread to a hungry prisoner, a German doctor who treated an injured British sentry with steady hands and silent respect. A group of men who shared cigarettes after work duty, not as foes, but as men momentarily freed from ideology. These fragments of grace never made headlines, yet they endured far longer than battles. Each act was a thread of repair woven into the fabric of Europe's conscience. Kindness didn't erase the horror, but it softened the edges, allowing grief to breathe instead of fester.
Years later, when survivors tried to explain how decency survived among ruins, they often spoke of these moments, gestures so small they seemed almost trivial, yet monumental in meaning. They revealed that healing does not roar, it hums quietly between people who choose restraint over rage. In that gentle rhythm of everyday mercy, the war that had destroyed so much began, in its smallest corners, to heal itself. Forgiveness, when it finally arrived, did not come as a grand proclamation, it came as a whisper. It lived in gestures too modest to notice, a letter answered without bitterness, a hand extended across language and loss, a decision to remember without hate. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was the quiet discipline of those who refused to be ruled by pain. It asked for courage, the kind that stands unarmed before the memory of suffering and still chooses gentleness. For the men who had endured both guilt and grace, this understanding grew slowly, like dawnlight through fog. They learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting what was done, but about freeing oneself from its weight. The British, by offering mercy, had shown that strength could exist without violence, authority without cruelty. In that revelation, something eternal stirred, the realization that humanity's truest triumph is not victory, but release. Evening settles gently over the empty camp. The fences stand silent now, the huts weathered but still upright, the wood carrying the faint scent of rain and time. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale begins to sing, its voice rising through the same air that once carried the sound of a human choir. If one listens closely, it almost feels as though the prisoner's voices still linger, soft, wordless echoes drifting between the pines. Long ago, men stood here in rows, their faces lifted toward that same gray sky, singing not for victory, but for remembrance. Those harmonies born from captivity became something more enduring than freedom itself, proof that even in confinement the soul could reach beyond walls. Now only the wind answers their memory, carrying it into the quiet fields beyond. And as the final imagined note fades, there is peace, not triumphant, not loud, but whole.